It was an early Saturday morning when I decided it was finally time to take care of something I had been putting off for weeks, draining and cleaning my pool. Summer was creeping in fast, and I didn't want another year of murky water and clogged filters. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees, casting a golden hue over the backyard. I had my coffee in one hand and a garden hose in the other, setting up the drainage just like I'd done every season since I moved in. Everything was going smoothly. I was calm, relaxed, and ready to tackle the job. What could possibly go wrong? I connected the drainage hose to the pool's outlet, making sure it was directed to the designated runoff zone at the side of my yard, exactly where the city guidelines instructed. I had reviewed the local regulations twice the night before just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Nothing was being dumped into the street, sewer, or anyone else's yard. This was all by the book. As the water started to flow, I settled into a chair nearby, mentally mapping out my weekend checklist. I figured I'd finish draining by noon, start scrubbing the walls after lunch, and have it refilling by evening. About 10 minutes in, I heard the unmistakable sound of a screen door slam. I didn't even have to look. I knew exactly who it was. Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog. She lived 2 houses down, but somehow always seemed to materialize whenever someone was doing anything remotely productive. I heard her sandals slap against the concrete as she made her way around her backyard, probably craning her neck to get a better view over the fence. I kept my focus on the task, hoping she'd just take her mental notes and walk back inside like she usually did. But not this time. Her voice cut through the peaceful morning air like a rusty saw. "Are you allowed to do that?" she barked, not even bothering with a hello. I looked up slowly, already sensing where this was going. I calmly replied, "Yes, I've checked the guidelines. I'm following all the city and HOA rules." She folded her arms, lips pursed, eyebrows raised like she was holding back the urge to cite me for some imaginary infraction. "Well, it looks like you're flooding the street. That could cause property damage. You know there are kids that play out here, right?" I stood up, walked over to the fence, and gestured clearly toward the runoff area. "Karen, look, the water is draining into my side yard. The street's dry. I've done this every year. It's not affecting anyone." She didn't even glance at where I was pointing. "We'll see about that," she muttered, spinning on her heel and storming back into her house. I didn't think much of it at the time. Karen's threats were usually hollow, and she was known for sending dramatic emails to the HOA about things like loud lawnmowers or suspicious gardening. But 5 minutes later, I heard sirens. At first, I thought it must be for someone else. Maybe an accident down the street or a medical emergency. But then a patrol car pulled up right in front of my house, lights flashing. My stomach sank. I walked out to the front yard, and sure enough, there was Karen standing next to the officer with her arms flailing and finger pointed straight at me like she had caught a criminal in the act. I approached calmly, greeted the officer, and asked what the issue was. Karen jumped in before he could respond. "He's flooding the entire neighborhood. I think he's illegally dumping pool chemicals. The water's going everywhere. It's a safety hazard." I was stunned. I didn't even know what to say at first. The officer looked at me and then glanced around. The street was bone dry. The only evidence of water was the slow trickle flowing into my own gravel runoff area, precisely where it was supposed to go. I told the officer that I had checked both HOA and city guidelines and followed them exactly. I even had the permit printed out in a folder on my kitchen counter. I offered to grab it, along with the instruction manual that showed my drainage system specs. He nodded politely and said that would help. Meanwhile, Karen kept pacing near the cruiser, muttering under her breath and occasionally shooting me nasty glares like I had committed some unforgivable act. I came back with the documents, handed them over, and let the officer inspect the area himself. After the officer took a good look around and reviewed the permits I had provided, he seemed visibly less concerned. The situation, in his eyes, didn't seem to warrant the emergency-level panic Karen had conveyed. He asked me a few basic questions: where exactly the water was going, whether I was using any chemicals during the drainage, and if I had done this before without incident. I answered calmly, pointing out that the hose was channeling clean water from the pool directly into the approved runoff area on my property, and that I wasn't using any treatment chemicals until after the pool was empty. The officer gave a nod, thanked me for my cooperation, and began walking back toward Karen. That's when her voice picked up again, louder this time, and filled with urgency. She was clearly not done. "You're just going to let him keep doing this?" she asked, her arms flailing like she was swatting invisible bees. "You don't understand. This water could be contaminating our whole neighborhood. It could overflow into the storm drains, into the community's landscaping, and then we'd all be paying for it." I listened in quiet disbelief. Not only was she exaggerating, but she was making up complete scenarios that weren't even possible. My runoff system didn't connect to the storm drains. It had its own filtration trench lined with gravel, exactly how the HOA had recommended in their pool maintenance guide. And the landscaping she referred to? That was over 200 feet away and uphill. Karen wasn't letting up. "This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior I've been warning the board about," she told the officer, trying to sound like she was speaking on behalf of the entire neighborhood. "If one person starts draining water without accountability, what's next? People flushing out paint, oils, who knows what else? The children play here. What if they get sick?" The officer maintained a neutral expression, nodding politely as she spoke, but I could tell even he was growing tired of her rant. She continued, insisting that the water looked cloudy and smelled off, which was bizarre considering she hadn't even stepped foot near my yard. From where she had been standing the entire time, she couldn't possibly see, smell, or know anything about the water quality. But facts weren't going to get in her way. Her performance escalated even further. She pulled out her phone and began recording both me and the officer, narrating as if she were hosting a documentary. "Here we have a homeowner carelessly draining a suspicious liquid into our neighborhood, while the authorities turn a blind eye," she said in a tone soaked with mock concern. "This is what we deal with when people think their property rights are more important than public safety." At this point, several of my neighbors had begun peeking out from their windows, a few even stepping outside to see what all the commotion was about. One of them, Dave from across the street, casually walked over and asked what was going on. Before I could speak, Karen pointed at me again and said, "He's draining his pool into the community runoff. It's going to cause flooding and could poison our lawns." Dave raised an eyebrow and looked over at the hose. "It's going into his side yard. That's what he's always done. I've drained mine the same way," he said, completely unfazed. "Never been a problem before." Karen's face twitched, clearly irritated that someone wasn't aligning with her version of events. "Well, just because it's been done before doesn't make it right," she snapped. "The rules have changed. There are environmental risks now. We should be more careful." She wasn't wrong about being cautious, but again, I had followed every environmental and safety guideline to the letter. The water had been tested, the trench was properly set up, and no one's property was being affected. Still, Karen was now in full theatrical mode, as if she were trying to manufacture a neighborhood emergency from thin air. She told the officer she would be contacting the HOA immediately and expected an emergency board meeting to be held. Then she threw in a line that made me realize just how personal this had become. He thinks he can just do whatever he wants because he has money and a pool. Well, this isn't that kind of neighborhood. That one sentence said it all. It wasn't about the water. It wasn't about the kids. It wasn't even about the rules. This was personal for Karen. She didn't like the fact that someone in the neighborhood had something she didn't, or did something without asking her permission. She needed to feel in control. And if that meant escalating a routine home maintenance task into a police matter, then so be it. The officer stood between us, clearly trying to de-escalate the tension, but Karen wasn't making it easy. She had started pacing now, arms crossed tight, voice rising every time she repeated the word illegal. I calmly stepped away from the spectacle and went inside to grab the folder I had prepared just in case something like this ever happened. Inside were printed copies of my city's water drainage policy, the email thread with the HOA's property manager confirming my method was compliant, and a screenshot of the permit I submitted through the municipal site. I even had time-stamped photos of my runoff trench, complete with gravel bed and filtration barrier, exactly as required. When I came back out, the officer looked relieved that I had something concrete to work with. He asked to see the documentation, and I handed it over. As he reviewed it, I also pulled up the videos on my phone from earlier in the morning, footage I had taken while setting up the drain system. My security camera had also captured Karen shouting from her patio before she called the police, which wasn't relevant to drainage, but certainly added context. The officer spent a few minutes reading through the paperwork. He asked a few clarifying questions, mostly about the direction of water flow, the filtration process, and whether I had ever received complaints in the past. I explained everything in a measured tone, showing where the water drained, how the filtration worked, and how I'd kept the water free of any chemicals until after the cleaning process. Karen was still standing nearby, practically buzzing with frustration as the officer nodded in agreement with my explanations. "He says he has a permit," she interrupted, gesturing with air quotes. "But how do you know it's valid? Anyone can print something like that online. I demand the city be contacted immediately. Someone from the Department of Water Safety should be here. Or the EPA." The officer turned toward her, politely but firmly explaining that my documents looked legitimate, and based on his visual inspection, I was in compliance with the law. He added that it wasn't his role to enforce HOA guidelines, but to address violations of public safety and city ordinances. And from what he saw, there was no threat or violation occurring. Karen looked absolutely outraged, as if the officer had just betrayed her personally. She tried to pivot again. "He has a security system aimed right at my yard. That's surveillance. It's a privacy violation," she snapped. "He recorded me without consent." Without raising my voice, I explained that the camera is pointed at my property for security reasons and clearly marked. The footage didn't capture anything inside her property, only the fence line where she had leaned over and shouted earlier. I mentioned that the footage was time-stamped and served only as evidence that she had initiated the confrontation and that I had remained on my own property the entire time. The officer sighed lightly and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, unless you believe a crime has been committed, I can't cite him for anything. Everything I'm seeing here checks out. His drainage system is on his property, the water flow is contained, and his documentation is in order." Karen's expression changed in an instant. Her face flushed red. Her mouth dropped slightly open in disbelief. It was the first time during the entire encounter that she was a loss for words. She tried once more, her tone switching to one of false concern. "I just don't want anyone to get sick," she said, glancing around as if speaking to an invisible audience of concerned neighbors. "I mean, what if a child runs through that water? We don't know what's in it." I pointed out, again, that no water was running into the street, sidewalks, or anywhere public. The filtration trench was built to prevent overflow, and even if a child ran across it, it would be no different than playing in a puddle after the rain. There were no chemicals present during the drainage, and the HOA's own documents supported my method. I offered to show the officer the PDF of the HOA's drainage policy, which I had saved on my phone. Karen scoffed and threw her hands in the air, muttering something under her breath about favoritism and corruption. At that point, the officer gave me back my documents, thanked me again for my cooperation, and assured me that no action would be taken against me. He walked back to his vehicle, taking a few notes on his tablet, while Karen stood motionless on the sidewalk, watching the whole thing unfold without the ending she had clearly been hoping for. Later that afternoon, I thought the situation had finally died down. The officer had left, the drainage was progressing without issue, and Karen had disappeared back in her house, probably to stew in her defeat. I went back to scrubbing the walls of the pool and prepping the filtration system for cleaning. I had music playing low, the sun was out, and I finally felt like I could get on with my weekend. But just when I started to feel normal again, I got a notification on my phone, a new email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Urgent. Drainage violation reported. Action required." I clicked it open, and sure enough, there was a formal notice of violation addressed to me. According to the email, a complaint had been filed alleging improper water drainage that could potentially affect common areas and neighboring properties. The HOA was investigating potential breaches of Section 14.2 of the neighborhood regulations regarding exterior water runoff and required an immediate response, including documentation of the drainage setup and a written statement explaining the event. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen wasted no time. Within hours of the officer walking away from her front lawn, she had already reached out to the HOA board, trying to use a different route to hit me with penalties. The funniest part was that Section 14.2 didn't even apply to pool maintenance. I knew because I had read every word of the HOA regulations the night before, anticipating this exact type of drama. Section 14.2 referred to irrigation systems that cross property lines or flood shared community landscaping, not self-contained pool drainage on private property with an approved runoff trench. Still, I played it by the book. I replied to the HOA with a calm, professional tone, attached all the same documentation I had shown the police officer, and included screenshots of the city's water code, as well as the permit I had secured. I even provided time-stamped photos showing that not a drop of water had touched the sidewalk or adjacent properties. I knew exactly what Karen was trying to do. She was hoping the HOA would take her side by default, or at least cause me enough of a headache to make me stop. The next day, I got another email, this time from the HOA's compliance officer. It said they had received my documents and were reviewing them with the board. In the meantime, they asked me to pause any further drainage activity until the matter was resolved. I replied promptly, stating that the pool was already drained and that I had complied with every city and HOA regulation. I also politely asked that the HOA refrain from interfering with routine maintenance unless a clear and documented violation had occurred. Hours later, I got a follow-up email. It was a more formal message, signed by the HOA board president, informing me that they were exploring the matter further and that my cooperation was appreciated. At that point, it was clear Karen had stirred up just enough doubt to force the HOA into a mini investigation, even though nothing I had done was outside the rules. The irony wasn't lost on me. This same HOA had previously praised my yard maintenance in a newsletter, but now, thanks to Karen's complaints, they were scrutinizing a perfectly legal pool drainage like it was a city-wide emergency. A few days passed, and I decided to take a closer look at the alleged violation in the HOA handbook again. I highlighted several sections that directly proved I was in the clear. I even drafted a brief timeline of events showing when the pool was drained, when the officer arrived, and how Karen had continuously made false claims without evidence. I submitted the entire package as part of my formal response to the complaint, knowing full well that the paper trail would expose how baseless the accusation was. What surprised me most wasn't that Karen had filed a complaint. It was how confidently she twisted the rules, hoping no one would challenge her. Her claim that I violated a drainage clause that didn't even apply was a calculated move. She counted on the HOA reacting to her voice louder than the facts. But this time, I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story. I had receipts, proof, and a history of compliance, and I wasn't afraid to use all of it to defend my right to do basic maintenance on my own property. A few days after the HOA notified me that they were reviewing my documentation, I received another unexpected twist. This one didn't come by email or police lights. It came through a conversation with my neighbor, Lisa, who happened to serve as the HOA board's treasurer. She and I weren't exactly close, but we exchanged greetings now and then, and I knew she had a reputation for being fair-minded and level-headed, unlike some others on the board. She caught me while I was out front checking on the sprinklers and walked over casually. "I saw the notice they sent you," she began, her voice low so no one else would hear. "Just wanted to let you know, Karen's not even on the board anymore." I looked up confused. I had assumed, based on how Karen barked orders and threw around HOA terminology like confetti, that she was still holding some kind of official role. At the very least, I thought she was on a subcommittee or had advisory status. Lisa clarified that Karen had resigned from the HOA board nearly 6 months ago after a dispute over budget transparency and misuse of community funds for beautification projects no one had approved. She had apparently been asked to step down after too many complaints from neighbors and one particularly intense board meeting that ended with several members walking out. That revelation was shocking, but it explained a lot. Karen wasn't filing complaints as an official HOA member. She was just doing it as a resident, pretending she still had some kind of authority. That changed everything. It meant that the urgency behind her complaint didn't stem from policy or official board action. It was purely personal and worse, completely misrepresented. Lisa continued, telling me that Karen had a bit of a history with this kind of behavior. She would frequently claim to speak on behalf of the HOA when issuing complaints or threats to neighbors, even though she no longer had any formal power. She had called code enforcement on a teenager for playing music too loudly at a birthday party, claimed a small garden statue was a safety hazard, and even tried to get a neighbor fined for repainting their door a slightly different shade of beige. The HOA had received more than a few emails about her aggressive and unsolicited rule enforcement, but most residents just ignored her. Unfortunately, when it came to me, she had managed to escalate it with enough drama to make the HOA pay attention, at least temporarily. With this new information, I composed another email to the HOA board, this time addressing Karen's lack of official capacity. I referenced my conversation with Lisa, included a copy of a prior HOA newsletter that showed the current board roster, which did not include Karen, and gently asked the board to clarify whether complaints from non-board members were being treated as official citations. I framed the question carefully, not as an accusation, but as a request for clarity on how policies were enforced and who had the authority to escalate them. The response I got was telling. A day later, the board president replied and acknowledged that Karen was not, in fact, an active member of the HOA board. He apologized for any confusion and said that complaints are reviewed regardless of who submits them, but that action is only taken when supported by policy violations or clear evidence. He stated that the board was still reviewing the drainage situation, but would factor in the new context. Privately, I knew this was a turning point. Karen had gone from meddlesome neighbor to someone pretending to hold authority she no longer had. She had spoken to the police like she was in charge. She had emailed the HOA with threats and official-sounding language. She had even implied I was breaking environmental codes, when really, she was just bitter that I didn't ask for her permission. It also made me reconsider the level of influence one persistent neighbor could have on an entire community. Karen had built up a reputation over the years, and even after stepping down, she managed to intimidate people simply by sounding like she knew what she was talking about. But the truth was she was bluffing, loudly and confidently, hoping that no one would dig deeper. Her performance worked in some cases, but this time, she overplayed her hand. The moment she pretended to be something she wasn't, her credibility began to crack. As the days passed, more neighbors began sharing their own stories. One mentioned Karen once threatened to report them for aggressive sunbathing because their lounge chair faced her fence. Another said she had counted the number of recycling bins left out past pickup time and tried to fine people. Her behavior was obsessive, performative, and built entirely on the illusion of power. Now, that illusion was starting to dissolve. A few weeks after the pool incident had seemingly settled down, I received a letter from the HOA board. It wasn't another violation notice or a vague warning. It was a formal resolution. The board had completed their review of the complaint, examined the documentation I submitted, reviewed the city ordinance and HOA bylaws, and ultimately concluded that I had done nothing wrong. The drainage was legal, contained, and followed every rule both in the city code and our HOA guidelines. The case was closed, but that wasn't the end of it. Around the same time, I was contacted by the HOA compliance officer who informed me that several other residents had come forward in the days following the incident with their own complaints about Karen. One neighbor claimed she had harassed their landscaper over the brand of fertilizer he was using. Another said she'd been caught photographing kids playing in the common green space and shouting at them for stepping on delicate grass. A third said Karen threatened to report them for painting their mailbox without submitting a request, even though the color matched the original exactly. With these new reports, the HOA decided to take a closer look at Karen's ongoing behavior. She may not have been an official board member anymore, but she was acting like she still wielded power. Power she was using to intimidate and pressure people, using HOA language to make her claims sound legitimate. It became clear that her actions weren't just isolated annoyances. They were part of a larger pattern of harassment. That's when I decided to take it one step further. I gathered every piece of communication I had from her, the video clips from my security system, The email she sent copying the HOA with her accusations and a printed copy of the formal complaint she'd filed. I also included a written summary of what happened during the police visit, with quotes from the officer and a list of everything I'd done to comply with local law. I submitted the entire packet directly to the HOA board, along with a request for a formal response to what I now believed was harassment and misrepresentation. I wasn't the only one. Several other neighbors did the same. Within 2 weeks, the HOA called an emergency meeting, not to address violations or permits, but to vote on a motion that would officially bar Karen from contacting board members directly without first going through the official resident complaint process. In effect, she was no longer allowed to send threats, make demands, or misrepresent her authority under the guise of concerned neighbor, acting on the HOA's behalf. What followed next came as a surprise even to me. The HOA, citing a history of abuse, misinformation, and neighbor intimidation, decided to issue Karen a formal warning, followed by a no-contact order regarding board matters. The board's attorney drafted a letter outlining that Karen was to cease direct communication with board members, refrain from citing HOA rules in confrontational situations, and stop presenting herself as a representative of the HOA in any capacity. If she violated those terms, the board reserved the right to escalate the matter through legal means, including seeking a civil harassment injunction. When I received my own copy of the board's decision, I'll admit I felt an enormous sense of relief. Not because I wanted to win some kind of battle, but because I had grown tired of the constant tension, the second-guessing every project I started on my property, and the fear that something as simple as draining a pool could become a public spectacle. Karen's behavior had created an atmosphere of paranoia, where neighbors were afraid to plant a tree, fix a fence, or even hold a birthday party without worrying she'd swoop in with some outdated regulation and start barking orders. The new restrictions placed on Karen weren't meant to punish her, but they were necessary to restore a sense of balance and fairness in the neighborhood. For years, she had operated on fear, manipulation, and a misplaced sense of authority. But now, with her credibility shattered and her influence removed, the rest of us could breathe a little easier. I could finally clean my pool, paint my deck, and water my lawn without worrying someone was documenting my every move. Other neighbors shared the same sentiment. The board's decision was a rare but powerful moment of accountability in a community that had long been held hostage by one person's obsession with control.